The heat of a forge is a living, breathing thing. To the uninitiated, it is merely a tool, a hazard of blistering temperatures and suffocating air. But to a craftsman of the old blood, the heat is a pulse. It is the rhythmic heartbeat of creation, the very essence of the earth channeled through coal, bellows, and will. Long before Izuku Midoriya ever lifted a hammer, long before he understood what it meant to be a hero in a world obsessed with genetic lottery tickets, a tear in the fabric of reality deposited a very angry, very blue dwarf into the industrial district of Musudafu, Japan. Brok, of the legendary Holdra brothers, had been navigating the space between the branches of the world tree when a localized spatial distortion, perhaps the volatile byproduct of a villain's quirk, perhaps a cosmic mistake, yanked him from the realm between realms. He landed face first in a dumpster filled with discarded ramen cups and rusted car parts in a universe completely devoid of Aesir, Vanir, or familiar magic. His first words in this strange, neon-lit world were a string of dwarven profanities so uniquely foul they would have made the ghost of Sparta himself raise an eyebrow. Brok quickly realized that the pathways back to the Nine Realms were closed to him. The ley lines here felt different, muted by the concrete and steel of a rapidly modernizing society. Yet survival was in his blood. He claimed an abandoned, subterranean subway maintenance hub, barricading it from the prying eyes of the surface world, and built what he knew best, a forge. He expected to live out his days in miserable, soot-stained solitude, crafting weapons out of scrap just to keep his hands busy. What he did not expect was Inko. She had been a young woman then, barely in her 20s, with hair the color of spring leaves and a heart far too big for the cynical city she lived in. She had wandered down an abandoned access alley, looking for a litter of stray kittens she had been feeding, only to stumble upon a squat, foul-mouthed man with sapphire blue skin dragging a massive girder of stolen steel down a flight of concrete stairs. Most people in Musudafu would have screamed. Most would have called the police or assumed he was a villain whose quirk made him look like a mythical troll. But Inko Midoriya just blinked, offered him a polite bow, and asked if he needed help carrying the metal. Brok had stared at her as if she had sprouted a second head. "The fuck are you looking at, lady? I got this under control. Scram before you get tetanus." Inko hadn't scrammed. She had scolded him for his language, marched down the stairs, and used her minor telekinetic quirk to lift the other end of the heavy steel girder. Brok, stunned into silence, simply grunted. That was the beginning. Inko began visiting the grumpy, blue-skinned man who lived beneath the city. She learned that he wasn't a man with a mutation quirk, but something entirely different, something ancient. She brought him decent food instead of the garbage he scavenged. She cleaned his cluttered, grease-stained living quarters. In return, Brok found himself inexplicably drawn to her quiet strength, her unyielding kindness, and the way she refused to tolerate his bullshit. He began making her things, intricate, impossible clockwork birds that flew around her apartment, a kettle that never boiled over, a necklace that hummed with a protective warmth. Love, Brok decided, was a lot like forging. It took intense heat, a lot of hammering out the flaws, and a stubborn refusal to let the metal break. Eventually, they married. It was a quiet affair, unrecorded by the bureaucratic headache of the Japanese government. How does one register a mythical dwarf for a marriage license, anyway? But, bound by a runic oath that Brok insisted was stronger than any piece of paper. A year later they had a son. Izuku was born on a sweltering day in mid-July. When the nurse handed the squalling bundle to Inko, Brok leaned over her hospital bed, his calloused, blue hands trembling slightly. The boy had his mother's unruly, curly hair, though the bright emerald green was tempered by a dark, metallic sheen. But what drew the nurse's whispers was the boy's skin. It wasn't the vibrant, startling sapphire of his father, but rather a muted, dusty slate blue, like the color of twilight over a snowy mountain. He was impossibly heavy for a newborn, thick-boned and dense. "He's beautiful," Inko had whispered, exhausted tears tracking down her cheeks. Brok had huffed, trying to hide the moisture in his own yellow eyes. "Course he is. Got my sturdy framework and your, well, everything else. He's gonna be a tough little bastard, I can tell you that." "Language, Brok," Inko chided gently, kissing the baby's forehead. Right. Sorry. He's gonna be a tough little rascal." Brok reached out a single, soot-stained finger. Infant Izuku's tiny hand snapped out, wrapping around his father's finger with a grip that made Brok's eyes widen. A wide, toothy grin split the dwarf's face. Oh yeah? The fires are gonna burn bright in this one. 4 years later, the world had fundamentally shifted for young Izuku. He lived in two realities. The first was the surface world, where he watched animated cartoons of brightly colored heroes soaring through the sky, punching villains and saving the day with a smile. The symbol of this world was All Might, a colossus of justice who Izuku idolized with every fiber of his being. The second reality was his father's forge beneath the city. It was a world of clanging metal, the smell of ozone and sulfur, glowing runes, and his father's relentless, colorful swearing. Izuku loved both worlds equally. He wanted to be a hero, but he also wanted to create. At 4 years old, however, society demanded that a child's path be chosen by their genetics. It was the age of quirks. The waiting room of the Muzidafu Pediatric Quirk Clinic was painted a sterile, nauseating pastel pink. Izuku sat swinging his legs, clutching an All Might action figure in his slightly blue, remarkably calloused little hands. Beside him sat Inko, wringing her hands nervously. On Izuku's other side was Brok, who was currently glaring at a potted fern as if it owed him money. Brok hated hospitals. He hated the smell of bleach, he hated the fluorescent lights, and most of all, he hated the way people stared at his family. Brok wore a custom-made trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat to obscure his features in public, passing himself off as a man with an extreme mutation quirk. Still, the other parents in the room cast sidelong, judging glances at the stocky, blue-skinned man and his slate-skinned child. If that lady over there keeps looking at us like we're a pair of fresh turds in a punch bowl, I'm gonna forge her eyeballs into a necklace, Brok muttered under his breath, leaning toward Inko. Brok, please, Inko hissed, her cheeks flushing crimson. Behave. This is important for Izuku. It's a load of horseshit is what it is, Brok grumbled, crossing his arms. Kid's fine. He's stronger than any of these snot-nosed brats here. Lifted a 50-pound anvil yesterday like it was a damn feather duster. Why do we need a man in a white coat to tell us what we already know? Because he needs an official registry, dear, Inko sighed. For school. And for his future. Midoriya Izuku? A nurse called out. The family of 3 was ushered into a small examination room. A few minutes later, a bald, bespectacled doctor walked in, holding a clipboard and looking entirely unimpressed. He examined Izuku, took a few blood samples, and ordered an X-ray of the boy's foot. When the doctor returned, he pinned the X-ray to a light box on the wall. He sighed, a tired, practiced sound. You should probably just give it up, kid, the doctor said bluntly, not even looking at Izuku, who was vibrating with excitement, holding his All Might figure high. The room went dead silent. Izuku's smile shattered, the action figure slipping a fraction of an inch in his grasp. Inko gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. Brok's yellow eyes narrowed dangerously. Excuse me? What the fuck did you just say to my boy? The doctor flinched at the profanity but quickly regained his clinical detachment, adjusting his glasses. I apologize for the bluntness, but it's better to nip these unrealistic dreams in the bud. Take a look at this X-ray. He tapped the glowing image of Izuku's foot. You see this joint here? The extra joint in the pinky toe. Studies show that when quirks began to manifest, the human body evolved to lose this joint to make room for the new genetic complexities. Izuku has 2 joints. He's a throwback. Completely baseline. Quirkless. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Quirkless. In this society, it meant weak. It meant fragile. It meant useless. No, Inko whispered, tears instantly brimming in her eyes. She looked at her son, whose large, dark eyes were wide with a heartbreaking realization. But my husband has a very powerful mutation, and I have a telekinetic quirk. Surely there's a mistake? The doctor shook his head. Genetics are a fickle thing, Mrs. Midoriya. Sometimes, despite the parent's traits, the child just doesn't inherit the active genes. He's healthy, albeit with a highly unusual skin pigmentation and bone density, which is likely just a cosmetic inheritance from his father. But as for superhuman abilities? He has none. Izuku slowly turned his head to his mother, his eyes welling with tears. Mom, can I still be a hero? Before Inko could break down, A sound like a thunderclap echoed through the small room. Crack! The doctor shrieked and jumped back. Brok had slammed his fist down onto the doctor's metal desk, completely caving in the steel surface and snapping one of the metal legs in half. The desk collapsed, sending files and pens clattering to the linoleum floor. "Listen to me, you bald-headed, pencil-pushing, half-wit son of a troll," Brok snarled, his voice a gravelly roar that seemed to vibrate in the very walls of the clinic. He stepped forward, grabbing the doctor by the lapels of his pristine white coat and lifting the man several inches off the floor. "Brok!" Inko cried, though she didn't step forward to stop him. "You think a picture of a damn toe determines what my boy is made of?" Brok spat, his breath smelling faintly of forge fire and raw iron. "You think this quirk nonsense makes a man? Quirks are a crutch. They're a shortcut for lazy bastards who don't know how to work with their hands, who don't know how to bleed for their strength. Sir, put me down. I'll call the police." The doctor stammered, terrified of the sheer, raw strength radiating from the short man. Brok sneered, dropping the doctor unceremoniously onto his backside. He turned his back on the trembling physician and walked over to Izuku. He crouched down so he was eye level with his son. Izuku was crying silently now, fat tears rolling down his dusty blue cheeks. Brok reached out, his rough, scarred thumb wiping away a tear. He grabbed Izuku by the shoulders, his grip firm and grounding. "You listen to me, Izuku," Brok said, his voice softer now, but carrying a weight that felt heavier than the earth itself. "You hear what this quack said? He said you ain't got a quirk? Good. It means you ain't got a handicap disguised as a gift." Izuku sniffled, rubbing his eyes. But All Might, heroes have quirks. And without what are they?" Brok challenged. "Take away their flashy fire, their fancy flying, and they're naked in the snow. They rely on something they were born with, not something they earned." "You!" Brok tapped a heavy finger against Izuku's chest, right over his heart. "You got Huldra blood in you. You got the blood of the greatest smiths across the 9 realms. We don't wait around for the gods to hand us power, boy. We forge it." Brok stood up, taking Izuku's small hand in his massive one. He looked back at Inko. "Come on, Inko. We're done here. The air in this place is making me sick." Inko wiped her eyes, a fierce, protective pride replacing her sorrow. She nodded, grabbed her purse, and followed her husband and son out the door, leaving the doctor trembling amidst the wreckage of his desk. As they walked out of the clinic and into the bright afternoon sun, Izuku looked down at his all-might figure, and then up at his father's broad back. The word quirkless still echoed in his mind, but beneath it, a new word began to take root. Forge. Understanding a concept in a doctor's office is one thing, living it on the playground is entirely another. By the time Izuku was 7 years old, the social hierarchy of his generation had been firmly established. At the top of the food chain was Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo had manifested a volatile, incredibly powerful explosion quirk. He was loud, aggressive, fiercely talented, and praised by every teacher and adult in his vicinity. He was destined for greatness, and he knew it. At the bottom of the food chain was Izuku. The kids in the neighborhood had already found Izuku weird. His skin was an odd, muted blue. His hair was a wiry mess of green and dark silver. He was shorter than the other boys, but absurdly broad in the shoulders, built like a brick wall even at 7. When the news spread that he was quirkless, the alienation shifted from passive avoidance to active hostility. It was a Tuesday afternoon in the local park. The air was thick with the humidity of late summer. Izuku was sitting on a bench, sketching in a scorched, leather-bound notebook his father had made for him. He wasn't drawing heroes posing. He was drawing the mechanical joints of the playground swing set, analyzing how the friction wore down the chains. "Hey! Deku!" Izuku sighed, closing the notebook. He knew that nickname. Bakugo had coined it. Deku. The one who can't do anything. Bakugo marched across the grass, flanked by 2 of his lackeys. One had wings like a bat, the other could stretch his fingers. Bakugo's palms were already popping with small, warning explosions, the smell of burnt caramel filling the air. "What are you doing, Deku? Drawing your stupid hero fantasies again?" Bakugo sneered, snatching the notebook from Izuku's lap before the blue-skinned boy could react. "Give it back, Kaken." It's not about heroes, Izuku said, his voice calm. He didn't cower. Brok had beaten the instinct to flinch out of him through rigorous hours in the forge. When hot slag flies at your face, you don't flinch, you face it, or you get burned. Bakugo flipped open the book, frowning at the schematic drawings of gears, pulleys, and weird, angular symbols, runes, though Bakugo didn't know that. What the hell is this nerd crap? You think drawing toys is gonna make you a hero? You're quirkless. You're a freak. I'm not a freak, Izuku said, standing up. Despite being an inch shorter than Bakugo, Izuku held his ground, his dark eyes locked onto Bakugo's red ones. And I don't need a quirk to build things that can help people. Give the book back, Bakugo's pride flared. He hated the way Izuku looked at him. There was no fear, no reverence. Just a stubborn, unyielding defiance. You want to build things? Bakugo laughed maliciously. He slammed his palms onto the leather cover of the notebook and let out a localized explosion. Boom! Fire and smoke enveloped the book. The lackeys cheered. Bakugo grinned, expecting the book to be reduced to ash. But as the smoke cleared, the leather cover was merely singed, the runic stitching Brok had woven into the binding glowing a faint, angry red before fading. The book was intact. Bakugo blinked, momentarily stunned. What the? Izuku didn't wait. With surprising speed, he stepped forward, grabbed Bakugo's wrist with one hand, and snatched the notebook back with the other. Bakugo yanked his arm back, furious. You damn extra! Bakugo roared, swinging his other hand, palm crackling with a much larger explosion, right at Izuku's chest. The blast hit point blank. The force of it knocked Izuku backward off his feet, sending him skidding into the dirt. The front of his t-shirt was incinerated, the fabric turned to ash in an instant. Serves you right, Deku! Bakugo yelled, panting slightly. Izuku groaned, sitting up in the dirt. He brushed the ashes of his shirt off his chest. The skin beneath was entirely unharmed. Not even a blister. Not a red mark. His slate blue skin had merely absorbed the heat, dispersing it harmlessly. Dwarven flesh, born of the volcanic heat of Svartalfheim and tempered by the primordial fires, did not burn easily. Bakugo stared, his jaw dropping slightly. How, you're supposed to be quirkless. I am, Izuku said quietly. He picked up his notebook, dusting it off. He looked at Bakugo, and for a moment, the anger of the Huldra brothers flashed in his eyes. My dad says only cowards use their tools to bully people who are just trying to mind their own business. Bakugo's face contorted with absolute rage. He charged forward, throwing a wild right hook. Izuku raised his arms to block. Bakugo's fist collided with Izuku's forearms. There was a dull thud, followed immediately by a sickening crack, and then a howl of pain from Bakugo. Bakugo stumbled back, clutching his right hand, tears springing to his eyes. Hitting Izuku's dense, heavy bones was like punching a solid block of granite. My hand! You freak! You broke my hand! Bakugo screamed, cradling his bruised knuckles. Izuku took a step forward, concern momentarily overriding his anger. Kaken, I didn't. Stay away from me! Bakugo yelled, retreating with his lackeys, who looked equally terrified of the blue boy who didn't burn and couldn't be punched. You're a monster, Deku! You'll never be a hero! Never! As Bakugo ran away, Izuku stood alone in the park. The adrenaline faded, leaving a hollow ache in his chest. He wasn't physically hurt, but the words stung. Monster. Freak. Never be a hero. He looked down at his tough, blue hands. He was different. He didn't fit in the box society had built for him. He was too hard, too heavy, too strange. Without realizing it, tears began to stream down his face. He picked up his notebook, clutched it to his bare chest, and ran. He didn't run home to his mother. He ran toward the industrial district. He needed the heat. He needed the one place where things that didn't make sense could be broken down and forged into something that did. The hidden entrance to Brok's subterranean forge was located behind a rusted, abandoned shipping container in a junkyard on the outskirts of the city. Izuku slipped through a gap in the corrugated metal, walked down a dark, steep flight of concrete stairs, and pressed his hand against the seemingly solid brick wall. The stone warmed to his touch, a hidden rune glowing blue, and the wall groaned, sliding open to reveal the cavernous workspace. The heat hit him instantly, a comforting blanket of 120-degree air. The cavern was massive, lit by the blinding white-orange glow of a central hearth. Anvils of varying sizes were scattered around, surrounded by racks of tools that no human blacksmith had ever seen, hammers with heads shaped like roaring beasts, tongs that hummed with kinetic energy, and bellows that breathed like sleeping dragons. Brok was at the main anvil, shirtless, sweat slicking his sapphire skin. He was hammering a piece of glowing celestial bronze, the rhythmic clang, clang, clang ringing out like a church bell. He didn't stop hammering as Izuku walked in, but he spoke over the noise. "You're home early from school, boy. And you're missing a shirt. Someone tried to set you on fire again?" "Yes, sir," Izuku said quietly, his voice raspy from crying. Brok paused, bringing his hammer down to rest on the anvil. He plunged the glowing bronze into a trough of dark, oily liquid. A massive hiss of steam filled the room. Brok wiped his brow with a greasy rag and turned to look at his son. His yellow eyes softened as he took in the boy's tear-streaked face. Brok sighed, tossing the rag onto a workbench. He walked over to a cooler in the corner, pulled out 2 glass bottles of imported dwarven ale, well, 1 ale for him, and a bottle of heavily spiced ginger beer for Izuku, and popped the caps off with his thumb. He walked over, handed the ginger beer to Izuku, and sat down heavily on a wooden crate. He patted the crate next to him. "Sit." Izuku sat, kicking his short legs. He took a sip of the spicy ginger beer. The burn in his throat felt good. "Bakugo?" Brok asked, taking a long pull of his ale. Izuku nodded. "He blew up my shirt. Then he punched me. He hurt his hand." Brok let out a barking laugh. "Stupid little shit. I told you, kid, you got bones like condensed iron. Ordinary folks punch you, they're gonna break their own hands." "Did you hit him back?" "No," Izuku said, staring at his boots. "I just stood there." "Good. Restraint. A weapon is only as good as the discipline of the man wielding it." Brok leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "So why the tears, boy? You didn't get hurt. You stood your ground." "Sounds like a win to me." "Because he's right," Izuku whispered, his voice trembling. "I'm a freak, Dad. I'm quirkless, but I'm not normal either. I'm just weird. People look at me and they see a villain, or a monster. How can I be a hero if people are scared of me? How can I save people like All Might if I don't have a quirk to make them feel safe?" Brok stared at his son for a long, quiet moment. The crackle of the hearth was the only sound in the cavern. "All Might," Brok spat the name like a curse. "I swear to the All-Father, that blonde buffoon has ruined this entire generation's understanding of what it means to be strong." Brok stood up and walked over to a rack of weapons. He reached out and grabbed a beautifully crafted sword. The blade was a shimmering silver, etched with delicate gold runes. He brought it over and held it out to Izuku. "Hold this," Brok commanded. Izuku put down his drink and took the sword with both hands. It was heavy, but perfectly balanced. The metal felt warm, almost alive. "Beautiful, ain't it?" Brok said. "I forged that blade for a king in Vanaheim a long time ago. Took me 3 months. Folded the steel over 1,000 times. Wove runes of wind and precision into the hilt. It can slice through solid granite like it's warm butter." Izuku stared at the weapon in awe. "It's amazing. Now let me ask you a question," Brok said, his voice dropping to a serious, gravelly tone. "If I took this sword, this masterpiece of magic and metallurgy, and I handed it to a toddler, is the toddler suddenly a great warrior?" Izuku frowned, looking up. "No. The toddler would just hurt himself. Or someone else." "Exactly," Brok roared, clapping his heavy hands together. "A weapon, a tool, does not make the warrior. It's the blood, the sweat, the mind, and the spirit of the man wielding it that matters." Brok snatched the sword back and pointed the tip of it toward the ceiling. "You think these heroes out there are any different? Most of them are just toddlers who were handed a magic sword the day they were born. They get a quirk, they think they're gods. They rely on it, they coast on it. And the second they run into a problem their quirk can't solve, they break like cheap pig iron." Brok knelt down in front of Izuku again, his intense yellow eyes boring into Izuku's dark ones. "You ain't got a quirk, Izuku. You weren't handed a magic sword. But you were born with a forge in your heart, and the blood of the greatest craftsman in the cosmos in your veins. You want to be a hero? You want to save people? Then you stop crying over the gifts you weren't given, and you start building the power you need. Brok reached out and tapped the side of Izuku's head. Your mind is sharper than any blade I ever made. Your will is harder than any armor. You want to be a hero? Fine. I'll teach you, but I ain't teaching you how to pose for cameras or smile like an idiot. I'm gonna teach you the old ways. I'm gonna teach you how to rip the secrets out of the earth, how to bind magic to steel, and how to forge yourself into an unbreakable weapon. You understand me? Izuku felt a spark ignite in his chest. It wasn't the flashy, instantaneous power of a quirk. It was something slower. Something hotter. It was the slow burn of coal catching fire. He looked at his calloused blue hands. They weren't meant to shoot fire or explosions. They were meant to make the things that shot fire and explosions. Izuku wiped his eyes, a fierce, determined glare replacing his sorrow. He looked his father dead in the eye and nodded. I understand, Dad. Teach me. Brok grinned, a terrifying, toothy smile. He stood up, walked over to a small workbench, and pulled out a heavy, blocky hammer. It was a beginner's tool, but forged from solid dwarven steel. He tossed it to Izuku, who caught it effortlessly despite its 50-pound weight. All right then, you little shit, Brok laughed. Grab an apron. The crucible starts today. And if you drop that hammer on your foot, I'm gonna laugh at you. The years that followed were a grueling, magnificent blur of fire, steel, and blood. While the other children in middle school were dealing with puberty and quirk counseling, Izuku was living a double life. During the day, he was the quiet, eccentric quirkless kid at Aldera Junior High. He endured Bakugo's bullying, though it changed in nature. Bakugo quickly learned not to hit Izuku, as it only resulted in bruised knuckles and sprained wrists. Instead, Bakugo resorted to verbal abuse and destroying Izuku's non-dwarven property. Izuku took it all in stride. He was polite, he was quiet, but he was no longer a victim. He viewed the middle school hierarchy as an anthropologist might view a primitive tribe. Their insults slid off his dense skin like water off a duck's back. Let them call him Deku. Let them think he was weak, because every afternoon, the quiet kid descended into the underground, and he became a god of the forge. Brok was a merciless teacher. He did not grade on a curve. If Izuku struck the metal at the wrong angle, Brok would berate him with a string of insults so creative they defied linguistic logic. You strike like a blind, asthmatic elf with a limp. Put your back into it, boy. The anvil is your enemy, make it submit. Izuku learned metallurgy before he learned algebra. He learned how to identify the carbon content of steel by the color of its sparks. He learned how to harvest rare minerals, which Brok somehow grew in specialized geochambers in the deepest parts of the cavern, and refined them into magical alloys. But the hardest part was the runes. Dwarven magic was not like a quirk. It was not instinctual. It was a science of the soul. Runes were symbols of absolute cosmic truth. To etch a rune of fire into a piece of steel, one had to truly understand fire. They had to feel its hunger, its wrath, its warmth. Izuku spent months meditating in front of the open hearth, just staring into the flames until his eyes watered and his skin blistered, simply to understand the concept of heat enough to carve the Kenas rune into a copper plate. When he finally succeeded, he was 10 years old. He carved the rune into a small throwing knife. When he threw the knife at a wooden target, the rune flared, and the blade exploded into a shower of white-hot plasma, incinerating the target instantly. Brok had cheered so loud he brought dust down from the cavern ceiling, and he rewarded Izuku by letting him curse freely for 5 minutes. Izuku awkwardly shouted poop, and Brok had sighed in profound disappointment. Physically, Izuku changed dramatically. The Holder blood, fueled by constant, brutal labor, manifested fully. By the time he was 13, he was no longer soft. He was 5'5", built like a miniature tank. His shoulders were incredibly broad, his chest deep and barreled. His skin retained that slate blue hue, but it was crisscrossed with tiny, pale scars from errant sparks and slipped hammers. His dark green hair was tied back in a messy, soot-stained tail. He wore thick boots, heavy canvas pants, and shirts that stretched tight over dense, corded muscle. His hands were a map of calluses, hard as diamond, stained perpetually gray with ash and oil. Inko watched her son's transformation with a mixture of immense pride and maternal worry. She ensured he still did his homework, made him eat massive portions of katsudon to fuel his insane caloric needs, and frequently scolded both him and Brok for tracking soot onto her clean carpets. "He's working too hard, Brok," Inko said one evening as she bandaged a burn on Izuku's forearm, a rare occurrence, meaning the fire had been magical in nature. Brok, who was polishing a set of tongs at the kitchen table, shook his head. "He's forging the foundation, woman. You can't build a skyscraper on a swamp. He wants to go to that fancy UA school next year? He's gonna be surrounded by kids who can shoot lasers from their eyes and turn into giant monsters. He needs to be harder than all of them." Izuku winced as Inko applied the antiseptic, not from the pain, but from the realization of how close the deadline was. 10 months. 10 months until the UA entrance exam. "I'm ready, Ma," Izuku said, his voice deeper now, rumbling with a gravelly undertone he had inherited from his father. "I have the designs. I have the materials. I just need to build the gear." Brok paused his polishing, looking at Izuku with a critical eye. "You're sure about the blueprints, boy? You're relying heavily on kinetic absorption and runic displacement. It's complex magic. One flawed carving on a joint, and the feedback loop will shatter your arms. I've double-checked the math, Dad. And the runes are solid. I'm using the Acer syntax for the bracing." Brok grunted, seemingly satisfied. "All right. Tomorrow, we start the final project. Your hero armor. And your weapon." Izuku's eyes lit up. "The hammer?" "The hammer," Brok confirmed, a feral grin spreading across his blue face. "It's time you learned how to truly strike." 14 years old. 10 months before UA. The cavern was silent, save for the roaring of the hearth and the ragged sound of Izuku's breathing. It was 2 a.m. Izuku stood before the grand anvil, stripped to the waist, sweat pouring down his blue-gray skin in rivers, evaporating instantly in the intense heat. In his right hand, he held a 50-pound forging hammer. On the anvil rested a massive billet of metal. It was a custom alloy Izuku had spent 3 weeks smelting, a blend of high-carbon Japanese steel, titanium, and a sliver of raw, starlight-infused URU metal that Brok had kept hidden in a vault for decades, saving it for a worthy project. The metal glowed a blinding, ethereal white. It hummed, vibrating with trapped kinetic energy. "Don't lose the rhythm, boy," Brok barked from the sidelines, his arms crossed. "The metal is fighting you. It doesn't want to be shaped. You have to force your will into the atomic structure. Dominate it." Izuku gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles popping. He raised the heavy hammer high above his head. He didn't just swing with his arms. He drove the force up from the soles of his boots, through his dense thighs, twisting his hips, channeling the torque through his back and down into his shoulders. Clang! The impact sent a shockwave through the cavern. Sparks of blue and gold erupted like fireworks, raining down on Izuku's bare skin, leaving tiny, sizzling burns that he ignored entirely. Clang! He struck again, shifting his angle by a fraction of a millimeter. He was folding the metal, compressing the magic into the core. Clang! Focus the rune! Brok shouted over the din. Bind the kinetic absorption into the head. Now! Izuku didn't use a carving tool. He used his intent. As the hammer fell, he visualized the ancient dwarven rune for endurance and force. He channeled his life energy down his arm, through the wooden haft of the hammer, and directly into the glowing steel. Clang boom! A shockwave of runic energy blasted outward, knocking over a rack of tongs and rattling the cavern walls. Izuku dug his boots into the stone floor to keep from being pushed back. The glowing white metal suddenly shifted colors. It pulsed from white to a deep, angry crimson, and finally settled into a shimmering, gunmetal gray laced with veins of glowing, neon green energy. Izuku stopped, his chest heaving, his muscles screaming in exhaustion. He let the forging hammer drop to the floor with a heavy thud. He reached out with a pair of massive tongs, gripping the newly forged head of his weapon, and lifted it. It was beautiful. It was a warhammer head, blocky and brutal, but with elegant, aerodynamic beveling. Along the flat sides, the runes he had envisioned were perfectly etched into the steel, glowing with an inner, emerald fire. He plunged the metal into the quenching trough. The hiss of steam was deafening, filling the cavern with a thick white fog. When the steam cleared, Izuku pulled the finished piece from the water. The metal was cool to the touch now, but it hummed against his palms like a living creature with a heartbeat. Brok walked over, his heavy footsteps echoing in the quiet. He looked at the hammerhead, then up at his son. For a long time, the old dwarf said nothing. He reached out and ran a callous finger over the glowing runes, checking the depth, the precision, the sheer magical density of the craftsmanship. The Aegis hammer, Izuku panted, wiping sweat from his brow, leaving a streak of black soot across his forehead. That's what I'm calling it. Brok pulled his hand back. He looked at Izuku, really looked at him. He saw the boy who had cried in a doctor's office 10 years ago. He saw the boy who had taken a point-blank explosion to the chest and hadn't flinched. He saw a craftsman. He saw a warrior. You did good, kid, Brok said softly, a rare, genuine warmth in his gruff voice. He clapped a heavy hand on Izuku's bare shoulder, squeezing tightly. It's a masterpiece. The Allfather himself would have a hard time breaking that. Izuku smiled, a wide, bright expression that belonged entirely to Inko Midoriya, contrasting sharply with his dwarven physique. Thanks, Dad. Don't get cocky, Brok immediately snapped, though his eyes were crinkling with pride. You still gotta forge the haft, the armor, the gauntlets, and calibrate the runic feedback loops. You got 10 months. You think you're gonna sleep? Sleep is for elves. We get back to work in 5 minutes, right? Izuku laughed, turning back to the forge. He stared into the roaring flames of the hearth. For his entire life, society had told him what he couldn't do. They told him he was quirkless. They told him he was weak. They told him he couldn't be a hero. Izuku gripped the heavy steel of his new hammerhead. Let the rest of the world rely on their genetic lottery. Let Bakugo rely on his sweat. Let the heroes fly and shoot their lasers. Izuku Midoriya, the blue boy of Mizurufu, the quirkless son of the Holdra brothers, was going to forge his own destiny. And he was going to hit Yui High School like a 10-ton anvil dropped from the sky. The halls of Aldera Junior High smelled of floor wax, stale sweat, and the suffocating anxiety of impending adulthood. For most third-year students, the final stretch of middle school was a time of panic studying and frantic career counseling. For Izuku Midoriya, it was simply an obstacle course of boredom he had to navigate before he could return to the forge. At 14, Izuku was a physical anomaly among his peers. While the other boys were stretching into lanky, awkward teenagers, Izuku had grown outwards. He stood at a modest 5'6", but he was built like a vault door. His shoulders strained the seams of the standard black Gakurin uniform, and his mother had been forced to custom tailor the fabric with heavy-duty Kevlar threading just to keep the armholes from tearing when he flexed. His skin, that muted slate blue hue, was a constant point of whispering among the student body. He sat at his desk, staring out the window, a heavy mechanical pencil dwarfed by his thick, calloused fingers. He wasn't taking notes on the math lecture. He was sketching the internal mechanisms of a collapsing haft for his warhammer. The Aegis hammer's head was finished, a masterpiece of runic engineering and alien metal, but a hammerhead without a handle was just a heavy rock. He needed a haft that could withstand the concussive feedback of his strikes without transferring the kinetic shock into his own bones, while simultaneously being compact enough to pass as a standard support item for the UA entrance exams. So, the homeroom teacher's nasally voice cut through Izuku's internal calculations. As third-year students, it's time to start thinking seriously about your futures and what you want to do with your lives. I could pass out some career aptitude tests, but... The teacher chuckled, grabbing the stack of papers on his podium and tossing them into the air. Why bother? I know you all want to go to the hero track. The classroom erupted into cheers. Students leaped from their desks, showing off their minor quirks, fingers elongating, small bursts of water, eyes glowing in the dim light. Yes, you all have wonderful quirks, the teacher said, waving his hands to calm the class. But remember, using your powers in school is against the rules. Sensei! Don't lump me in with this bunch of losers. The loud, abrasive voice of Katsuki Bakugo silenced the room. Bakugo leaned back in his chair, his feet kicked up onto his desk, a cocky smirk plastered across his face. I'm not gonna be stuck at the bottom with the rest of these rejects. I'm going straight to the top. The class immediately broke into angry murmurs, which Bakugo ignored, sparks crackling playfully in his palms. The teacher adjusted his glasses. Ah, yes, Bakugo. You're aiming for UA High School, aren't you? A collective gasp echoed through the room. UA was the pinnacle of hero academies. The acceptance rate was less than a fraction of a %. That's right, Bakugo declared, jumping onto his desk. I aced the mock test. I'm the only one at this crappy middle school who has a chance. I'm gonna surpass All Might and become the top hero, and I'll be the richest, most famous hero in the world. Oh, speaking of UA, the teacher interjected, looking down at his clipboard. Midoriya, you're applying for UA as well, right? The classroom went dead silent. Every head turned slowly toward the back of the room, staring at the stocky, blue-skinned boy quietly sketching in his notebook. For a second, the silence held. Then, the classroom exploded into laughter. Midoriya? You're kidding! He's quirkless! What's he gonna do, build a house for the villains? They don't even let quirkless people take the exam, do they? Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't shrink into his chair. He calmly closed his notebook, clicked his mechanical pencil shut, and met the gaze of his classmates with a steady, unblinking stare. The laughter faltered slightly under the weight of those dark, intense eyes. There was a density to Izuku's presence, a gravitational pull that made the other students instinctively uneasy. Slam! An explosion rocked Izuku's desk, splintering the cheap wood along the edges. Bakugo stood over him, his face contorted in a mask of absolute fury, smoke curling from his right hand. Listen to me, Deku, Bakugo snarled, leaning down so his face was inches from Izuku's. You're worse than these damn rejects. You are completely quirkless. You think you can stand in the same arena as me? You think a freak with a wrench can be a hero? Izuku looked at the smoking scorch mark on his desk, then slowly looked up at Bakugo. He didn't smell fear. He smelled burnt sugar, and the acrid tang of insecurity. Brok's voice echoed in the back of Izuku's mind. A dog that barks that loud is just trying to convince you he's a wolf. The UA guidelines were updated 3 years ago, Kaken, Izuku said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in his chest. There is no rule against quirkless applicants. And I'll be applying for the hero course using support gear. Bakugo grabbed Izuku by the collar of his uniform. Or he tried to. Izuku's center of gravity was so low and his mass so dense that Bakugo couldn't actually lift him out of the chair. Frustrated, Bakugo simply hauled himself closer. Support gear? You think some toys you built in a garage are gonna make you equal to me? Bakugo hissed. If you try to take that exam, you'll die in the physical portion. Don't you dare get in my way, you quirkless piece of shit. Izuku reached up and wrapped his thick, gray-stained fingers around Bakugo's wrist. He didn't squeeze hard enough to break bones. He had learned that lesson years ago. But he squeezed hard enough to completely immobilize Bakugo's arm. Bakugo's eyes widened slightly as the sheer, immovable strength clamped down on him like an industrial vice. A blade doesn't need to scream to cut, Kaken, Izuku said softly, his voice devoid of anger, which somehow made it vastly more intimidating. I'm not trying to get in your way. I'm forging my own path. If we cross, we cross. Izuku released his grip. Bakugo yanked his arm back as if he had been burned, rubbing his wrist, glaring daggers at Izuku. But he didn't attack again. He spun on his heel, kicking Izuku's desk on his way back to his seat. You're a dead man, Deku, Bakugo muttered, though the bravado was slightly hollow. Izuku just sighed, opening his notebook again. He needed to calculate the tensile strength of the collapsing haft. He had work to do. The walk home from school was Izuku's designated time for mechanical review. Most teenagers listened to music or texted their friends. Izuku walked with his head down, examining a heavy, cylindrical object in his hands. It looked like a thick, high-tech metal baton, roughly a foot long, forged from a dark, matte steel. Intricate grooves were carved into the surface, forming a complex lattice of dwarven runes that lay dormant, completely invisible to the naked eye until activated. This was the prototype haft for the Aegis hammer. He hadn't attached the head yet. The haft alone weighed roughly 40 pounds due to the dense Svartalfheim alloys he had used. To anyone else, it would be a struggle to carry. Izuku flipped it end over end in his right hand like a drumstick. His route took him under a long, shadowed overpass. The sunlight faded, replaced by the cool, damp gloom of the concrete tunnel. Izuku tapped the top of the baton with his thumb, pressing a hidden switch. With a sharp, metallic snick, the baton telescoped outwards, locking into a solid, 3-foot-long staff of unbreakable steel. The locking mechanism is still a bit stiff, Izuku thought, frowning. I need to lubricate the internal gears with Leviathan oil, or the kinetic shock might jam the retractor. A strange gurgling sound echoed through the tunnel. Izuku stopped, his ears catching the wet, squelching noise. It sounded like a blocked sewer pipe suddenly bursting. He turned around, his grip instinctively tightening on the steel shaft in his hand. Rising from a manhole cover behind him was a mountain of foul-smelling, dark green sludge. The muck piled higher and higher, forming a massive, undulating wave of viscous liquid. 2 massive, bulbous eyes and a jagged, manic mouth formed in the center of the mass. Well, 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 the sludge villain gurgled, his voice sounding like it was filtered through a swamp. A medium-sized meat suit. A bit odd-looking, but you'll do perfectly. I just need to hide out for a bit until that maniac loses my trail. Before Izuku could step back, the sludge villain lunged. A wave of thick, putrid slime crashed over Izuku, knocking him to his knees. The villain moved with surprising speed, wrapping tendrils of muck around Izuku's arms, his torso, and surging up toward his face. The sludge forced its way into Izuku's mouth and nose, tasting of raw sewage and rotting garbage. Don't fight it, kid! The villain laughed, his slimy body constricting around Izuku like an anaconda. It'll only hurt for about 45 seconds. Then it'll all be over, and I'll have a brand new disguise. Panic is a natural human reaction to suffocation. The brain screams for oxygen, the body thrashes wildly, and logic goes out the window. But Izuku was only half human. The blood of the Huldra brothers pumped through his veins. Dwarves were creatures of the deep earth. They survived in volcanic ash clouds, in cavernous depths where the air was thin and poisonous, and in the blistering heat of the cosmic forge. Izuku's lung capacity and cellular oxygen efficiency were vastly superior to a normal human's. He didn't have 45 seconds. He had about 10 minutes before he would even begin to feel dizzy. Izuku didn't thrash. He went completely still. Analysis, Izuku thought, his mind crystal clear despite the sludge filling his mouth. Fluid-based villain. Physical strikes will pass right through him. He is applying pressure to my chest to crush my ribs and force the air out. The villain grunted, pouring more of his mass around Izuku's torso, squeezing with enough force to crack solid concrete. Izuku's condensed, iron-like bones didn't even creak. What are you made of, kid? The villain muttered, confused by the absolute lack of give in his victim's body. Why won't you pop? Izuku's eyes, glowing with a sudden, fierce intensity, locked onto the villain's floating eyeballs. Slowly, deliberately, Izuku raised his right arm. The villain tried to hold the arm down, piling hundreds of pounds of sludge over Izuku's shoulder, but the boy's strength was monstrous. Izuku's arm lifted, tearing through the viscous fluid like a ship's prow through water, bringing the steel haft of his hammer up to his chest. Izuku couldn't speak to activate the runes, but he didn't need to. He clamped his thumb over the primary runic trigger on the hilt. He visualized the harsh, jagged angles of the Isa rune, the primordial symbol of ice and stasis, taught to him by Brok, who had copied it from the frozen wastes of Niflheim. He channeled his kinetic energy into the steel. The haft flared with a blinding, piercing blue light. A shockwave of absolute zero temperature exploded outward from the metal. The effect was instantaneous. The sludge villain shrieked, a sound that quickly turned into a crackling, frozen gasp as the water content in his body flash froze. The muck encasing Izuku turned into solid, brittle ice in a fraction of a second. Izuku flexed his shoulders, shattering the frozen shell around his upper body. He spat out a chunk of frozen sewage, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand in disgust. Gross, Izuku muttered, his voice gravelly. He stood up, stepping out of the frozen mold of his own legs. The sludge villain was completely immobilized, a jagged, terrifying ice sculpture of muck and eyeballs, trapped in a state of suspended animation. Izuku spun the steel haft in his hand, preparing to deliver a concussive strike to shatter the villain into harmless, frozen pebbles, when a tremendous force blew the manhole cover completely off its hinges. "Have no fear, citizen," the voice boomed through the tunnel, echoing with a sheer, overwhelming resonance that made Izuku's teeth rattle. A massive, towering figure burst from the sewers, landing on the concrete with a heavy thud. He wore a white t-shirt and green cargo pants, but his sheer muscle mass and the iconic, V-shaped golden hair were unmistakable. Izuku's eyes widened. "All Might. Because I am." All Might struck a heroic pose, his fist drawn back, ready to unleash a devastating smash. He paused, his blue eyes blinking in confusion as he took in the scene. He looked at the frozen, immobilized sludge villain. Then he looked at the stocky, blue-skinned teenager holding a glowing steel rod, looking mildly annoyed by the taste of sewage in his mouth. "Here?" All Might finished, his booming voice dropping an octave in sheer bewilderment. He stood up straight, rubbing the back of his neck. "Well, this is unexpected." Izuku stared at his lifelong idol. His heart hammered in his chest, a wave of pure, Fanba adrenaline washing over him. This was All Might. The symbol of peace, the man whose videos he had watched thousands of times. But as Izuku looked at the towering hero, Brok's voice drifted through his thoughts again. "They rely on their gifts. They're just men, boy. Powerful men, sure. But flesh and blood all the same. Respect the work, not the pedestal." Izuku took a deep breath, grounding himself. He clicked the button on his staff, collapsing it back into a 1-foot baton, and clipped it to his belt. He offered All Might a deep, perfectly executed Japanese bow. "It is an honor to meet you, All Might, sir," Izuku said politely. "I apologize if I interfered with your pursuit. The villain ambushed me." All Might coughed, a small speck of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth, though he quickly wiped it away, hoping the boy hadn't noticed. "Interfered? My boy, you subdued a highly dangerous villain, and with a rather remarkable quirk, I might add. Ice generation? No, wait." All Might leaned closer, peering at Izuku's blue skin. "A mutation type with elemental properties? I'm quirkless, actually," Izuku corrected smoothly, reaching into his pocket. "It's support gear. I'm aiming for the UA Hero course, so I've been field testing some of my defensive tools. Speaking of which..." Izuku pulled out his scorched, runic-stitched notebook and held it out, completely deadpan. "Could I please get your autograph? It would be a highly valued addition to my developmental logs." All Might stared at the boy. "Quirkless?" The hero looked at the frozen mountain of sludge. The ambient temperature in the tunnel had dropped by 10 degrees. Whatever technology this kid was using, it was incredible. "Ah. Of course. A proactive citizen and a future hero." All Might boomed, taking the notebook. He signed his name across a full 2 pages with lightning speed. "Here you go, young man. Now I must collect this miscreant and deliver him to the authorities." All Might produced 2 large, empty soda bottles from his pockets. With practiced ease, he began breaking off chunks of the frozen villain, stuffing the ice sludge into the bottles and screwing the caps on tight. Izuku watched, a small frown forming on his face. "Are you sure plastic bottles are sufficient containment for a fluid shifter? Once the ice thaws, the internal pressure from his expansion might rupture the plastic if the threading isn't reinforced." "Ha ha ha! Do not worry, young man. I will have him at the police station long before he thaws." All Might shoved the bottles into his deep cargo pockets. He bent his knees, the muscles in his legs bulging impossibly large. "Thank you for your assistance. Continue to strive for your dreams." "Wait, All Might, the structural integrity of those pockets," Izuku started, stepping forward. "I must be off. Pro-heroes are constantly battling time as well as villains." With a deafening sonic boom, All Might leaped into the air, launching himself out of the tunnel and into the sky, leaving a gust of wind that nearly blew Izuku over. Izuku stood in the sudden silence of the tunnel. He looked up at the sky, rubbing the back of his neck. His localized wind pressure was impressive, but his attention to containment protocols is severely lacking. Izuku sighed, turning to walk home. He needed to wash his mouth out with soap. Dwarf or not, sewage was sewage. High above the city, All Might soared through the air, his mind racing. A quirkless boy with gear that powerful? He didn't even flinch when I arrived. He was analyzing my containment methods. UA is going to have their hands full with that one. Suddenly, a sharp pain flared in All Might's side. His time limit was rapidly approaching. His form flickered, a burst of steam erupting from his muscles. As he flinched, his hand brushed against his cargo pocket. Unbeknownst to the symbol of peace, the sheer force of his jump had jostled the frozen bottles. The cheap plastic caps, not designed to hold a compressed, rapidly thawing villain, had cracked. As All Might soared over the Tatooine shopping district, one of the bottles slipped from his pocket, plummeting toward the busy streets below. Izuku had just made it to the edge of the shopping district, desperately looking for a convenience store to buy a bottle of water, when the ground shook. A massive explosion echoed from a few blocks away, followed by the scream of panicked civilians and the billowing of thick, black smoke. Izuku's dwarven instincts flared. Fire meant the forge, but uncontrolled fire meant destruction. He broke into a heavy, ground-eating run, his boots pounding against the pavement. He didn't run like a normal teenager. His strides were short, but incredibly powerful, carrying his dense frame forward with terrifying momentum. He rounded the corner and skidded to a halt. The entrance to the shopping arcade was engulfed in flames. Buildings were burning, storefronts shattered, and a crowd of terrified onlookers was being held back by a hastily formed police barricade. Standing in the center of the inferno was the sludge villain. He had thawed completely, and he was massive, twice the size he had been in the tunnel. And worse, he had a hostage. Trapped in the center of the muck, thrashing wildly, was Katsuki Bakugo. Bakugo was firing off explosions from his palms in a desperate panic, but the blasts were only igniting the surrounding buildings and giving the sludge villain more collateral damage to revel in. Izuku scanned the area. The pro-heroes were there. Death Arms, Kamui Woods, and Empty Lady were standing by the police line. Why aren't they moving? Izuku thought, his eyes narrowing. He moved closer, weaving through the crowd until he was at the front. He could hear the heroes talking. It's no good. Death Arms shouted, shielding his face from the heat. I can't punch slime. And there's no way I can reach the kid with those explosions going off. My wood will ignite the second I get close. Kamui Woods gritted his teeth. I'm incompatible with this situation. I need 2 lanes just to walk. I can't do anything in this tight alley. Empty Lady groaned in frustration. We just have to wait for someone with a suitable quirk. Death Arms concluded, gritting his teeth. Hold the line. Keep the fire from spreading. Izuku stared at them, absolute disgust washing over him. A suitable quirk? Brok's teachings burned in his mind. If a smith refuses to forge because he doesn't have his favorite hammer, he's not a smith. He's a fraud. You use the tools you have, or you make new ones. You do the work. These heroes, these highly paid professionals, were standing there watching a teenager suffocate to death because their innate genetic abilities weren't perfectly suited to the scenario. They were paralyzed by their own limitations. They were relying on their magic swords, and without them, they were useless. Izuku looked back at the villain. Through the swirling smoke and roaring flames, his eyes met Bakugo's. Bakugo's red eyes were wide, bloodshot, and filled with a terror Izuku had never seen before. The arrogant bully was gone, replaced by a terrified kid who was actively drowning in sludge. For a split second, Bakugo looked at Izuku. It wasn't a glare. It was a plea for help. Izuku didn't think. The time for analysis was over. The time for the forge was now. He vaulted over the police barricade. Hey! Kid! Get back here! You'll die! Death Arms roared, reaching out to grab him. But Izuku was already gone, sprinting directly into the inferno. The heat of the burning buildings washed over him, but to his Svartalfheim-tempered skin, it felt like nothing more than a warm summer breeze. The flames licked at his uniform, singeing the fabric, but leaving his slate-blue skin completely unharmed. You again? The sludge villain roared as Izuku broke through the smoke. I'll kill you this time, you little freak. The villain raised a massive tendril of sludge, preparing to slam it down on Izuku like a whip. Izuku didn't slow down. He reached to his belt, but not for his hammer haft. He reached to a small, leather pouch tied to his hip, a gift from his uncle Sindri, an enchanted bag of holding that defied internal dimensions. Izuku plunged his hand in and pulled out what looked like a jagged, glowing yellow crystal encased in a cage of dark metal. "Cover your eyes, Kaken!" Izuku roared, his voice booming over the sound of the fire. Izuku hurled the crystal directly at the sludge villain's massive face. As the metal cage made impact with the sludge, it shattered. The crystal inside, a dwarven sunstone, mined from the realm of light, Alfheim, and pressurized by Brok into an explosive flashbang, detonated. It wasn't just a bright light. It was a localized, miniature supernova. A blinding, searing flash of pure, celestial radiance erupted in the alleyway. The entire crowd, the pro-heroes, and most importantly, the sludge villain, were blinded instantly. The villain shrieked in agony, the pure light searing his sensitive, liquid body, causing him to instinctively recoil and loosen his grip on Bakugo. Izuku didn't close his eyes. Brok had made him stare into the heart of the forge until he was immune to the glare. Izuku closed the remaining distance in 2 massive bounds. He drew the steel baton from his belt, snicked. The haft extended to its full 3-foot length. He didn't have the hammerhead attached. He didn't have the time to pull it from Sindri's pouch and screw it on. He would have to use the haft alone. It wouldn't carry the sheer concussive force of the Aegis head, but the runes were still active in the grip. Izuku leaped into the air, his heavy boots launching him over the villain's flailing tendrils. He positioned himself directly above the villain's main mass, right where Bakugo was trapped. Izuku gripped the steel staff with both hands. He channeled every ounce of his Hoga strength, bypassing the ice rune this time, and directly feeding his kinetic energy into the blunt force shockwave limiters in the metal. "Get your hands!" Izuku growled, his eyes blazing with dwarven fury. "Off my classmate!" Izuku swung the steel haft down with the force of a falling meteor. When the steel struck the sludge, it didn't just pass through the liquid. The kinetic limiters in the haft released all the stored energy Izuku had fed it in a single, devastating, localized shockwave. Boom! The impact sounded like a bomb going off. The sheer concussive force ripped the sludge villain's molecular structure apart. The liquid mass literally exploded outward in a massive, radial splash, blowing away the surrounding flames and shattering the windows of the nearby shops. Bakugo, freed from the slime, fell forward. Izuku dropped his staff, caught Bakugo by the collar of his uniform, and landed heavily on the concrete, his boots cracking the pavement beneath his dense weight. He shielded Bakugo with his own body as the shockwave dissipated, raining globs of unconscious villain all over the street. The alley fell silent, save for the crackling of the dying fires. The flashbang's light faded. The pro-heroes and the crowd rubbed their eyes, blinking away the spots. When their vision cleared, they gasped. The sludge villain was plastered across the walls, the street, and the buildings, completely unconscious and unable to reform. In the center of the cratered street stood Izuku, completely unharmed, holding a coughing, gasping Katsuki Bakugo. For a moment, the world stood still. Then, the crowd erupted into cheers. The aftermath was a chaotic blur of police sirens, paramedics, and angry heroes. Bakugo was swarmed by paramedics, who praised his resilience and his powerful quirk, though Bakugo remained uncharacteristically silent, staring at the ground, his hands shaking slightly. Izuku, on the other hand, was currently being aggressively lectured by Kamui Woods and Death Arms. "What were you thinking?" Death Arms yelled, jabbing a finger at Izuku's chest. "You're a kid! You charged into a hostage situation without a quirk, used an unlicensed, highly dangerous explosive device, and nearly got yourself killed. There was absolutely no reason for you to intervene." Kamui Woods added sternly. "We had the situation contained. We were waiting for a hero with the right quirk to arrive." Izuku stood there, his arms crossed over his broad chest. His uniform was singed, but his blue skin was untouched. He listened patiently until the heroes finished their tirade. Then, he uncrossed his arms. "Contained?" Izuku repeated, his voice low, but carrying a heavy, undeniable authority that made both pro-heroes flinch slightly. The fire was spreading to 3 different commercial complexes. The hostage had less than 2 minutes of oxygen remaining before permanent brain damage occurred. You were not containing the situation. You were watching him die. "Now listen here," Death Arms started, his face flushing. "No, you listen," Izuku interrupted, channeling his father's blunt, unforgiving logic. You are professional heroes. You wear the badge, you take the pay, and you accept the responsibility. But the moment your specific, genetic gifts became incompatible with the problem, you surrendered. You stood by and waited for someone else to do your jobs. Izuku pointed a thick, callous finger at the crater in the street. I am quirkless. I don't have super strength. I don't have wood manipulation. I used a simple flash-emitting support item to disable the villain's optics, and a kinetic baton to disrupt his physical structure. It took me 30 seconds. If a tool is useless outside of a narrow parameter, it belongs in the scrap heap. If you can't save someone without your quirks, then you shouldn't be heroes. The silence that followed was deafening. Kamui Woods looked down, shame crossing his wooden features. Death Arms opened his mouth to argue, but couldn't find the words. The sheer, blunt truth of the boy's words cut deeper than any blade. Before the argument could escalate, a skeletal, blond man in an oversized suit stumbled out of the crowd, coughing violently. No one paid him any mind, assuming he was just a sickly bystander. Izuku, satisfied that his point was made, gave the heroes a curt bow. I will accept whatever fines the police issue for illegal use of support gear. Good evening. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd before the police could formally detain him. Bakugo watched Izuku leave, his fists clenched so tightly his palms bled. He didn't say a word. Izuku walked home the long way, needing the cool evening air to clear the adrenaline from his system. His muscles ached slightly. Using the kinetic haft without the hammerhead meant his arms had absorbed some of the shock, but it was a good ache. He had done it. He had applied the lessons of the forge to the real world. He had saved a life. I am here! Izuku nearly jumped out of his skin as All Might bounded out of a side alley, landing directly in front of him in his massive, muscular form. All Might! Izuku gasped. What are you? Before Izuku could finish, All Might deflated in a massive cloud of steam, leaving behind the skeletal, coughing man Izuku had noticed in the crowd earlier. Izuku blinked. He stared at the frail man, then looked around, then looked back at the man. His dwarven mind, attuned to the mechanics of reality, quickly did the math. Your muscular form is a temporary state, Izuku concluded instantly. An inflation of muscle mass, likely fueled by a stockpile of energy. But your base form has suffered catastrophic physical trauma. Your respiratory system sounds compromised, and your posture indicates missing internal organs. Left side? All Might, wiping blood from his chin, stared at Izuku in absolute shock. You figured all that out in 5 seconds? I build things, sir. I know what structural damage looks like, Izuku said gently. He didn't judge the man. He felt a profound sense of respect. This man was operating a broken machine, pushing it to its absolute limits for the sake of others. You are a remarkably perceptive young man, All Might sighed, leaning against a brick wall. You are correct. 5 years ago, a villain destroyed my respiratory system and a large portion of my stomach. I can only do hero work for about 3 hours a day now. Izuku nodded slowly. I see. It explains why you dropped the bottles. Your time limit expired, causing a lapse in physical coordination. All Might groaned, burying his face in his hands. Yes. It was my fault that villain escaped. I was pathetic. I stood in the crowd, watching that boy suffocate, because I had no time left. I am a hypocrite. All Might looked up, his hollow blue eyes locking onto Izuku. But you were incredible. You, a quirkless boy with nothing but your own creations, charged in when I hesitated. You acted. You embodied the essence of what it means to be a hero. All Might stood up straight, a fire burning in his sunken eyes. Young man, I have been looking for a successor. Someone to inherit my power. I believe you are worthy. I want to pass my quirk, one for all, down to you. Izuku stood frozen, the symbol of peace. The greatest hero in the world. He was offering Izuku his power. The ultimate quirk. The magic sword that would instantly make him unstoppable. It was everything he had ever dreamed of when he was a 4-year-old boy crying in a doctor's office. But Izuku was no longer that boy. He was the son of Brok. He was a smith. Izuku looked down at his hands. They were stained gray, calloused, scarred from burns and cuts. They were the hands of a creator. If he took All Might's power, he would be relying on a tool forged by another man. He would be using a shortcut. Izuku looked up at All Might. He smiled, a genuine, gentle smile. He offered the number 1 hero a deep, respectful bow. Thank you, All Might. It is the greatest honor of my life that you would deem me worthy of such a gift, Izuku said softly. He stood up straight, his dark eyes resolute. But I must decline. All Might's jaw literally dropped. You decline? But, it's the strongest quirk in the world. You could be the next symbol of peace. My father, Izuku said, his voice rumbling with quiet pride, taught me that true strength isn't given. It's forged. He told me that borrowing another man's tools makes you a sloppy craftsman. If I take your power, I'll never know what my own hands are truly capable of. Izuku tapped the steel baton hanging at his belt. I don't need a quirk to be a hero, All Might. I'm going to build my power, piece by piece. I'm going to forge my own destiny. All Might stared at the blue-skinned boy. He saw no arrogance in Izuku's eyes. He saw only an unbreakable, titanium-clad resolve. For the first time in his life, All Might felt that his quirk wasn't needed. All Might smiled, a soft, genuine expression. You are a very strange young man, Midoriya Izuku. But I believe you. I look forward to seeing what you forge. Thank you, sir, Izuku smiled. He turned to leave, but paused. Oh, by the way, All Might? Yes, my boy, you should really invest in titanium-reinforced carrying cases for villain containment. Plastic is a terrible insulator for magical and kinetic energy. Have a good evening. With that, the blue boy of Mizurafu walked away into the night, leaving the symbol of peace laughing quietly in the alleyway. The UA entrance exams were 10 months away, and Izuku had a hammer to finish. The morning after the sludge villain incident, the world felt different to Izuku Midoriya. It wasn't that the sky was bluer or the birds were singing louder. It was the heavy, undeniable truth settling in his chest. He had made a choice. By rejecting one for all, the greatest quirk in the world, he had slammed the door on the easy path. He had looked the symbol of peace in the eye and essentially declared that a hammer, an anvil, and his own 2 hands were enough to rival the power of the gods. Now, he had 10 months to prove he wasn't completely out of his mind. Breakfast at the Midoriya household was a quiet, hearty affair. Inko had prepared a massive spread, 6 bowls of rice, 3 whole grilled mackerel, a mountain of tamagoyaki, and a steaming pot of miso soup. Izuku, whose dwarven metabolism demanded caloric intakes that would terrify a professional sumo wrestler, ate with steady, mechanical efficiency. Brok sat across the table, shoveling food into his mouth with his bare, blue hands, entirely ignoring the chopsticks resting by his plate. You're in the papers, boy, Brok grunted around a mouthful of rice, tossing a crumpled newspaper onto the table. Izuku paused, wiping his mouth. He looked at the paper. There, on page 4, was a blurry photograph of him standing over the cratered sludge, shielding Bakugo. The headline read, Quirkless Teenager Intervenes in Villain Attack, Heroic Recklessness or Illegal Vigilantism? They spelled my name wrong, Izuku noted dryly, pointing a thick finger at the caption which read Izuku Midoriya. Let him, Brok snorted, taking a massive gulp of black coffee. Fools don't need to know your name until you give them a reason to fear it. But let's talk about what really matters. You told the big blonde buffoon to shove his magic powers up his ass. Inko nearly dropped the teapot. Brok. Language? And what do you mean, magic powers? Brok waved a dismissive hand. Doesn't matter. Point is, the boy made a commitment. He chose the forge. And that means the kitty gloves come off. Brok leaned forward, his yellow eyes locking onto Izuku's dark ones. The casual, grumpy father was gone. The master smith of the 9 realms had taken his place. 10 months, Izuku. UA. High school ain't gonna accept a kid with a fancy stick and a good attitude. You need armor. You need a completed weapon. You need to be forged. I have the blueprints, Izuku said, tapping his forehead. I know what I want to build. But my current materials, they aren't enough. The Aegis head is URU and Svartalfheim steel, but the armor needs to be lightweight, heat-resistant, and capable of channeling runic feedback. The local scrapyards don't have what I need. Even the titanium carbide blends at the industrial docks have too many impurities. They'll shatter if I try to engrave a kinetic absorption rune into them. Brok smiled. It was a terrifying, jagged thing. You think I've just been sitting on my blue ass for the last 14 years, boy? You think that little workshop behind the shipping containers is all I've got? Izuku blinked. It's not. Brok stood up, cracking his neck. Grab your boots, kid. Tell your mother you love her. You're not gonna see sunlight for a while. We're going deep. Muzidafa was a coastal city, built on layers of modern concrete, pre-quirk infrastructure, and ancient bedrock. But beneath the bedrock, deep within the Earth's crust, lay the primordial fires that shaped the planet. Brok didn't lead Izuku to the usual hidden door in the junkyard. Instead, they walked for miles, leaving the city limits, heading toward the mountainous region of the Shizuoka prefecture. They hiked for 3 hours until they reached a seemingly abandoned cave system blocked off by government warning signs about unstable geology. Brok kicked the steel warning fence down with a single, lazy boot strike. They walked into the pitch-black cave. Izuku activated a small, runic glowstone from his belt, casting a pale green light over the jagged stalactites. When I first fell into this ass-backward dimension, Brok echoed off the damp walls, I realized the magic here was stagnant. The ley lines were choked by concrete and cell-phone towers. But the Earth? The Earth is the same everywhere. It remembers the old magic. You just gotta dig deep enough to find the roots. Brok stopped in front of a solid, seamless wall of obsidian at the back of the cave. He placed his massive hand against the black glass. He began to chant. It wasn't Japanese, and it wasn't English. It was a guttural, vibrating language that made Izuku's teeth ache and the air pressure drop. It was the tongue of the Huldra. The obsidian didn't open like a door, it melted. It dissolved into a shimmering portal of molten gold and red ash. A wave of heat blasted out of the opening, so intense it immediately singed the tips of Izuku's dark green hair. The smell of sulfur and ancient, burning carbon washed over them. Welcome to the real forge, boy, Brok grinned. I call it the Huldra Crucible. Watch your step. The floor hates you. Izuku stepped through the portal, and his breath hitched. They were standing on a suspended precipice of black basalt, overlooking a massive, subterranean cavern that defied all logical geology. A river of roaring, white-hot magma flowed through the center of the chamber, illuminating the space with a blinding, hellish glare. The walls were lined with glowing veins of raw, unrefined minerals, pulsing purples, deep crystalline blues, and angry, fiery oranges. In the center of the magma river sat an island of dark stone, upon which rested a forge. But this wasn't an anvil and a bellows. This was an industrial-scale dwarven altar of creation. Massive gears carved from solid bedrock turned lazily, powered by the thermal updrafts. Chains the size of buses hung from the ceiling, holding colossal crucibles suspended over the magma. This is incredible, Izuku breathed, his dark eyes wide, reflecting the magma's glow. The ambient heat alone is over 2,000 degrees. A normal human would combust just standing here. Good thing you ain't a normal human, Brok snorted, walking down a narrow, treacherous staircase carved into the cliff face. Come on. The 10-month clock starts now. When they reached the central island, Brok didn't hand Izuku a hammer. He handed him a crude, heavy iron pickaxe that looked like it weighed 100 pounds. First rule of the crucible, Brok ordered, his voice booming over the roar of the magma. If you want to wear the armor, you have to bleed for the ore. I ain't handing you refined ingots. Look at the walls, boy. Izuku looked up at the cavern walls. Veins of glowing blue and silver or pulsed through the basalt. That's etherium quartz mixed with deep earth vibranium, Brok explained. It's highly magically conductive, lightweight, and tough as a troll's skull. It's exactly what you need for your suit's runic weave, but it's encased in igneous rock, and the cavern walls are crawling with magma centipedes. You have to climb up there, mine it with that pickaxe, haul it down, and smelt it yourself. Izuku looked at the towering, 90-degree cliff faces. He looked at the heavy pickaxe. Then he looked at the river of magma below. No safety harnesses? Izuku asked politely. Brok laughed, a harsh, barking sound. Gravity is your safety harness. It guarantees that if you fuck up, you won't have to worry about the consequences for very long. Now get climbing. The first month broke Izuku down. While students like Bakugo were practicing their explosive forms, and others were doing push-ups on the beach, Izuku Midoriya was surviving a subterranean Hell's Cape. Mining the Ethereum quartz was a nightmare. Izuku had to scale the sheer, razor-sharp basalt cliffs using only his bare hands and the heavy pickaxe. The ambient heat baked the moisture from his lungs. Every time he swung the pickaxe, the shockwave rattled his dense bones, threatening to dislodge him from the wall. Then came the wildlife. Brok hadn't been joking about the magma centipedes. These were predatory, silicon-based lifeforms the size of large dogs, armored in obsidian plates, that fed on thermal energy. The first time one ambushed Izuku on the wall, it nearly bit his arm off. Izuku had to crush its skull with his pickaxe while hanging upside down 200 feet above a river of lava. By the end of the second month, Izuku's body had adapted. He was no longer just a strong teenager. He was becoming a force of nature. His slate-blue skin had darkened slightly, tempered by the constant exposure to extreme heat and abrasive ash. The calluses on his hands were so thick they felt like steel plating. His muscles didn't bulge grotesquely like a bodybuilder's. They were compressed, dense, and corded like steel cables beneath his skin. He moved with a deliberate, grounded grace. A dwarven center of gravity meant he could stand his ground against a speeding truck and not move an inch. By month 4, Izuku had mined a literal ton of raw ore. Now came the smelting. Brok forced Izuku to operate the massive, bedrock gears of the forge manually. Izuku had to pull the colossal chains to lower the crucibles into the magma, holding hundreds of tons of suspended weight through sheer physical strength and stubbornness. When the ore melted, Izuku poured it into molds, the radiant heat singeing his eyebrows and turning the air into a shimmering mirage. Too slow! Brok would roar, throwing chunks of slag at Izuku's head. The slag is cooling. If impurities get trapped in the Ethereum matrix, your armor will shatter the first time you channel a kinetic rune. Move your ass, boy. Izuku didn't complain. He didn't whine. He absorbed the insults, internalized the lessons, and pushed harder. He learned to feel the molecular structure of the metal. He could close his eyes and listen to the hiss of the cooling ingots, knowing exactly when the carbon bonded with the vibranium. During his brief rest periods, sleeping on a slab of warm stone for 4 hours a night, Izuku updated his notebooks. But these weren't standard hero analysis notebooks anymore. These were grimoires. He sketched runic arrays, calculating the specific geometry required to bind the Algi's protection rune with the Soilo energy/sun rune. He needed his armor to not only stop physical blows but to absorb the kinetic energy of an opponent's quirk and vent it harmlessly as ambient heat. It's a delicate balance, Izuku muttered to himself one evening, chewing on a piece of dried, heavily salted beef. If I weave the chain mail too tight, the kinetic venting will backfire into my own nervous system. I need a localized spatial distortion to act as a buffer between the armor and my skin. But how do I weave a spatial rune into a physical thread? You don't, you absolute amateur. You ask your incredibly handsome uncle for help. Izuku snapped his head up. Standing a few feet away, brushing invisible dust off his immaculate, gold-trimmed leather armor, was a man. He had the same short, stocky build as Brok, but his skin was a normal, pale human tone, and his beard was impeccably groomed. He was currently holding a silk handkerchief over his nose, looking at the subterranean forge with an expression of profound, existential horror. Sindri! Brok bellowed from across the magma river. The fuck are you doing here? I thought you said this dimension smelled like used diapers and disappointment. Sindri gagged slightly, waving the handkerchief. It does, Brok. It truly, deeply does. I had to scrub my dimensional compass with pure Valkyrie tears just to find you. And this cavern. Ugh. The spores, the ash. Do you have any idea what breathing pulverized basalt does to your alveoli? It's a respiratory nightmare. Sindri practically teleported, moving with that bizarre, unexplainable swiftness unique to him, appearing right next to Izuku. He immediately pulled out a small, glowing wet wipe and began aggressively scrubbing a patch of soot off Izuku's cheek. Uncle Sindri. Izuku smiled, enduring the frantic cleaning. It's great to see you. How did you get past the dimensional barrier? Oh, it's a long story involving a favor from a rather unpleasant Norn and a very complex spatial fold algorithm, Sindri sighed, tossing the soiled wipe into the magma and pulling out a fresh one to clean his own hands. But I couldn't miss my favorite nephew's grand debut. Your mother sent me a message through the Raven Network. She says you're applying for the UA Hero Academy? Sounds terribly violent and unhygienic. It's the best path for me to help people, Izuku said proudly. Sindri stopped cleaning and looked at Izuku. His anxious, twitchy demeanor softened. He smiled, a warm, genuine expression. Look at you. You're huge. You've got Brok's shoulders and Inko's. Well, Inko's lack of a foul mouth, thank the gods. Sindri reached into a small pouch at his belt. It was a seemingly ordinary leather satchel, but as Sindri reached his arm in, it sank all the way to his shoulder. Now, Sindri said, his tone turning professional. I heard you muttering about spatial runes and kinetic venting. Brok is a genius with heavy metals and blunt force, I'll give him that. I heard that, you prissy little germaphobe. Brok yelled, hammering a plate of steel in the distance. But Sindri continued, ignoring his brother. When it comes to the delicate, microscopic weaving of magic, you need the Sindri touch. Sindri pulled his arm out of the bag. In his hands he held two items. The first was a spool of thread. But the thread wasn't made of cotton or silk. It looked like spun starlight. It was impossibly thin, glowing with a faint, iridescent light, shifting colors as the heat of the forge hit it. Mistweave, Sindri presented it proudly. Spun from the fog of Niflheim and the coarse silk of a realm weaver. It is functionally indestructible, entirely frictionless, and possesses natural spatial expanding properties. If you use this to bind your Ethereum chainmail to the inner lining of your suit, it will create a microscopic dimensional gap, about a millimeter of empty space, between the armor and your skin. Kinetic feedback will dissipate into the void before it ever touches your body. Izuku's jaw dropped. His analytical mind raced, instantly comprehending the sheer, impossible physics of the material. Uncle Sindri, this is priceless. This defies the conservation of mass. I know, isn't it wonderful? Sindri beamed. He then held up the second item. It was a utility belt made of rich, dark dragon leather, featuring several small pouches and one larger satchel that rested on the right hip. And this, Sindri said, his face turning incredibly serious, is the Mastercraft bottomless pouch. The one I gave you a few years ago was a prototype, a mere parlor trick. This one is attuned to your specific biomagical signature. It has practically limitless internal storage, sorted by your subconscious intent. You reach in for a wrench, it gives you the wrench. You reach in for a collapsed hammerhead, it gives you the hammerhead. Izuku took the belt reverently. Thank you. This solves all my mobility and weight distribution issues for my support gear. There is only one rule, Izuku, Sindri said, leaning in close, his eyes wide with utter terror. You must never put anything covered in blood, viscera, or unsanitary biological fluids into that pouch. Do you understand me? If you get villain guts inside the extra-dimensional space, the bacteria will multiply in a timeless vacuum, and create a plague that could wipe out 3 realms. Plus, it's just really, really gross. I promise, Uncle Sindri. No blood in the pouch. Izuku swore, deadpan. Excellent. Sindri clapped his hands. Now, let's get you cleaned up and start tailoring. You smell like roasted pork in despair. Months 5 through 9 were dedicated to the actual forging of the armor and the completion of the weapon. Izuku's workspace became a chaotic symphony of modern engineering and ancient dwarven magic. He had his mother's old sewing machine set up on a block of obsidian, modified with a diamond-tipped needle just to pierce the thick Kevlar weave fabric he had chosen for the base layer of his suit. The aesthetic was important. Izuku didn't want to look like a mythical knight or a clanking golem. He was living in modern Japan, aiming for a modern hero school. His suit needed to look utilitarian, sleek, and heroic, paying subtle homage to his idols while remaining distinctly his own. The base bodysuit was a deep, forest green, a nod to his mother's hair and the traditional colors he had always drawn in his notebooks. But beneath the dark green fabric lay the true power, a full-body undersuit of Ethereum chainmail, bound with Sindri's mistweave thread. The rings were microscopic, allowing Izuku complete, unhindered flexibility, but when struck, the rings locked together, forming a surface harder than diamond. Brok handled the heavy plating. Together, father and son forged the outer armor pieces, a reinforced chest plate, heavy combat boots, and intricate, segmented gauntlets. The metal was a matte, gunmetal gray, but the edges were etched with glowing blue runes that pulsed in time with Izuku's heartbeat. The gauntlets are the focal point, Izuku explained to Sindri one afternoon, carefully carving the Thurasaz rune into the left bracer with a laser scalpel. The Aegis hammer is going to generate massive amounts of concussive force. The mistweave will stop the shock from breaking my arms, but the energy has to go somewhere. I've designed these gauntlets with mechanical heat vents. He pressed a hidden trigger on his palm. The segmented armor on his forearm popped open like the gills of a shark, revealing glowing, red-hot coils within. When I strike the hammer, the runic feedback is channeled up the haft, into the gauntlet, converted into thermal energy, and vented outwards as superheated steam. Izuku smiled. It prevents me from exploding, and gives me a close-range defensive smoke screen. Brok, watching from afar, wiped away a single, soot-stained tear. He's weaponizing the exhaust. The boy is a fucking artist. Finally came the most important piece, the Aegis hammer. Izuku retrieved the glowing, runic hammerhead he had forged back in the junkyard. He took the telescoping steel haft he had used against the sludge villain. Placing them on the central anvil, Izuku worked for 3 straight days without sleep. He had to bind the two pieces together, not just physically, but magically. He poured Leviathan oil into the intricate gears of the haft, ensuring the retraction mechanism could withstand 1,000,000 pounds of pressure. He wove threads of gold and yaryu through the connection point, sealing the bond with a blast of dragon fire from the forge's central bellows. When it was finished, it lay on the anvil. It was a one-handed warhammer. The haft was wrapped in dark green leather for grip, culminating in a heavy, blocky steel head that radiated a terrifying, latent power. The runes along the flat sides of the head were dark, waiting to be awakened. "Pick it up," Brok commanded. Izuku reached out. As his callous, blue fingers wrapped around the leather grip, the hammer recognized its creator. The runes flared to life, glowing a brilliant, piercing emerald green. A low, thrumming hum filled the cavern, vibrating in the chests of everyone present. Izuku pressed his thumb against the primary trigger. Snicked. The haft collapsed instantly, shrinking the weapon from a 3-foot warhammer down to a heavy, 12-inch cylinder that easily slid into a customized holster on Izuku's new utility belt. "Perfect," Izuku whispered. It was the night before the UA entrance exam. 10 months had passed. The subterranean cavern was quiet. The massive gears were stilled, the magma river flowing lazily in the background. Izuku stood in the center of the workspace, looking into a full-length, soot-stained mirror Brok had brought down from the surface. He was suited up. He didn't look like a quirkless kid who had been bullied his whole life. He looked like a vanguard. The dark green bodysuit fit perfectly over his heavily muscled frame. The gunmetal gray armor plates covered his chest, shins, and forearms. The Ethereum chainmail peeked out at the joints, shimmering faintly in the dim light. Around his waist was Sindri's dragon leather belt, holding several modular support items, the flashbang sunstones, a spool of capture wire, and the collapsed Aegis hammer resting on his right hip. His boots were heavy, steel-toed, and lined with impact-absorbing runes. His hands were covered in fingerless, thick leather gloves, the segmented heat vents of his bracers resting silently on his forearms. To complete the look, Inko had insisted on a final touch. Wrapped securely around his neck, draped over his shoulders like a short, rugged cape, was a dark red scarf, a splash of vibrant color that tied the whole suit together, and paid homage to the classic heroes he had idolized as a child. He reached up, pulling a sleek, metal half-mask over his mouth and nose. It was a respirator, designed to filter out toxic gases, a lesson learned from the sludge villain, and protect his face, giving him an intimidating, mechanical silhouette. Izuku stared at his reflection. His dark green hair, tied back in a neat tail, his slate blue skin contrasting with the red scarf. His dark eyes burned with an unyielding confidence. "I am not quirkless," he thought to himself. "I am a Huldra. I am a hero." Footsteps echoed behind him. Brok and Sindri walked up. Sindri sniffled, dabbing his eyes with a sterile wipe. "Oh, you look absolutely terrifying, Izuku. I'm so proud." Please don't get any viscera on the mistweave. It's dry clean only, and I don't trust this dimension's solvents. Brok crossed his massive arms. He looked at Izuku from head to toe. The gruff, foul-mouthed dwarf remained silent for a long, agonizing minute. Is the weight distribution okay? Izuku asked, suddenly self-conscious. I was worried the chest plate might restrict lateral movement. Shut up, boy, Brok interrupted softly. Brok stepped forward. He reached up and placed both of his heavy, scarred hands on Izuku's armored shoulders. The yellow eyes of the master smith met Izuku's. For 10 months I've broken you down, Brok said, his voice thick with emotion he would deny to his dying day. I threw you into the fire. I made you bleed. I made you sweat. I made you curse the day you were born. Brok gripped Izuku's shoulders tighter. And you didn't break. You tempered. You took every ounce of heat, every strike of the hammer, and you forged yourself into steel. The world up there. Brok pointed a thumb toward the ceiling, toward the surface, toward UA High School. They think power is a lottery ticket. They think they're special because of an accident of birth. Brok smiled, a fierce, proud, fatherly smile. Tomorrow, you walk into that exam, and you show 'em the difference between a cheap toy and a fucking masterpiece. You show 'em what the forge can do. Izuku felt a lump form in his throat. He reached up, placing his hands over his father's. I will, Dad. I promise. Brok sniffled, quickly turning away and aggressively wiping his nose on his sleeve. Right. Well. Enough of this sappy shit. Get your ass to bed. You need at least 4 hours of sleep, and your mother made a celebratory katsudon that is getting cold. If you're late for the exam tomorrow, I'll weld your boots to the floor. Izuku smiled beneath his mask. He unclipped the Aegis hammer from his belt, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of the steel in his palm. Tomorrow, he would face the greatest hero school in the world. He would face robots, quirk users, and Katsuki Bakugo. Izuku was ready. Let the anvil ring.